Well, good afternoon and welcome to our fifth panel of the day, which is on the very timely subject of standards in public life. If you've not been following the news, so far this week, we have seen a former Prime Minister found to have misled the House and committed a serious contempt. We've had a former President facing criminal charges in a federal court. And we've had a former Italian Prime Minister who was jailed, I think, for tax fraud, receiving a state funeral. So it's a very good time to be thinking about the questions that we'll be asking today. Why do standards in public life matter? Who sets them? Who enforces them? What is the role of political checks or judicial checks or bureaucratic checks? What are our responsibilities as voters or perhaps as participants in the media or as a political culture? And we've got three wonderfully well-equipped speakers to help us think about these questions. And I'll introduce each of them before they speak. So we're going to begin with Robin Butler, or Lord Butler of Brockwell, who was the Cabinet Secretary and head of the Home Civil Service from 1988 to 1998. And that was a period that saw two very important innovations in the standards regime. The first in 1992 was the publication of the Ministerial Code. It wasn't called the Ministerial Code at the time, but it came to be known as that, something that hadn't been done before. And then the second in 1994 was the creation of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, chaired by Lord Nolan, which is particularly famous for its first report, which set out 7 standards for public life, which became known as the Nolan Principles. So we're delighted to have you here. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good, well. Thank you, Robert. I do indeed feel that I was in at the beginning of all of this, because I became Cabinet Secretary in 1988, and John Major decided, under pressure from Professor Hennessy, to publish what had up to then been called Questions of Procedure for Ministers, which was a confidential document. Moreover, despite the fact it was issued to all ministers when they entered the government, never leaked. Most extraordinary thing about those days. Anyway, that became the Ministerial Code. I think John Major hoped that that would hold ministers to account, and indeed it did. Of course, what it did was to give the media criteria against which they could judge the behavior of ministers, and a lot of people would say that was a good thing. But far from eliminating stories of that sort, we then had sleaze, we had cash for questions, we had Jonathan Aitken, which I so incompetently investigated, and that led John Major to set up the Nolan Committee on Standards in Public Life, and that followed by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. And that, similarly, didn't deal with the issue. When the Labour government came in, we had the Eccleston tobacco advertisements, and eventually Blair set up the Advisor on Ministerial Standards, which is now occupied, has sensationally been occupied recently by Geit. And so the question really I want to ask in my few moments is, has all this made things better? And I think the answer is there are not fewer episodes of criticism of ministers, indeed, or members of Parliament. Indeed, we get them all the time. And what's the reason for that? Well, it may be, is it because politicians have become rather more rather than less venal? And I actually don't believe that that is the reason. There have always been temptations for politicians, for members of Parliament, and for ministers. And I think there are, if you look back in history, there would be more scandalous cases, but in a more deferential age and a less media-intrusive age, they weren't often disclosed. Have the media become more intrusive? Well, certainly yes. They've certainly become less differential. Is that a bad thing? No, I think most of us would say that it's a good thing. Or is it that standards have changed? Is it because we are more sensitive to misbehavior by those who represent us that now this has become such an issue? Well, perhaps we have, but it doesn't seem to have solved the story. So let me now just say, what further could be done about it. And I am rather of the view that some of the recommendations that have been put forward wouldn't make things better than they are now. First of all, the Committee on Standards in Public Life, pressure for that to be made statutory. The government has resisted that, I think correctly, because if you make something statutory, what you are effectively doing is bringing in the judges. And I think legal activity in this area isn't going to solve the problem. It would lead to a lot of tortuous procedures, but it wouldn't solve the problem. The other thing that has been suggested, and again I'm perhaps in a minority in opposing, and has been recommended by the Committee on Standards in Public Life, is that the Prime Minister's advisor on ministerial standards should be able to institute inquiries on his or her own account. Again, I don't think that is a sensible approach. The truth is that no inquiry into what happens in government will work unless the Prime Minister has authorised it and authorised the machine to cooperate with it. So I don't think either of those much advocated are further remedies. So what is the remedy? Well, I think that my remedy is the old-fashioned one. It's the good chaps principle. And if ever there was an example of it, we see it today, that I think a lot of the very low standards which we've seen in the last few years have come from the top of government. And the top of government has shown that it has not stood up for high standards. But today, I think is a good day. It's a good day for Parliament because a committee of Parliament has shown that it can't be cowed, that it can be effective. I believe that the Privileges Committee has reached the right conclusion, and I believe it is effectively for Parliament to control its own affairs. It is, after all, the highest court. Now, if Parliament fails on that job, that would be bad. But today, I think it has succeeded.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful start. Our second speaker is Sir Chris Bryant. Chris is the MP for Rhondda, and in 2020 he became chair of the Committees on Standards and Privileges, though he recused himself from the recent investigation into Boris Johnson. He's also the author of a 2-volume history of Parliament, which means that he's very well placed to think about these questions over a longer period of time. We're very grateful to you for coming on what must be a very busy day, and we're looking forward to your thoughts.
He got a round of applause when he came up with a saying.
I also got one at the end.
Yes, we'll see, won't we? I confess my brain is a bit fuggy today because, weirdly, I've been doing interviews about standards in public life, and because the best decision I've ever made in my life was to recuse myself from the Privileges Committee report, because it meant there was somebody who could talk about it. None of the members on the committee have been able to talk about it, and I think they all deserve medals, to be honest. The vituperative attacks on them have been extraordinary. Not just from members of Parliament and members of the House of Lords, but from certain sections of the media who've wanted to, fight the battle on Boris's behalf. And from their own party members. There are threats of intimidation going around again today about if anybody votes for this report, they'll be deselected as a Conservative candidate and all that kind of stuff. And so I think they deserve a medal each. I don't know whether you've been discussing this earlier, but it just seems to me extraordinary that the BBC at the moment and several broadcasters are engaged in this line of, oh, well, there's two sides to this argument. No, the truth is, it is now proven that he is a liar. That is the end of the story. There isn't another version of this story. He's a liar, and he's behaved like a child. He's such a coward that he's run away from Parliament, facing the music in Parliament, and he's run away from his voters in Uxbridge as well. And I'm not going to stay here very long today because I've got to go to the by-election in Uxbridge. They say, somewhere in the Bible, I can't remember where, it says there is nothing new under the sun. And there is an argument that that is true because, of course, John Profumo was found to have lied. It all came out in a very bizarre way because he was sort of challenged in the chamber of the House of Commons by 4 MPs in a late-night debate about something completely different. And he decided to make a statement the next day, which was the lie. And of course, when he was found out for having lied, he was not only thrown out of the House of Commons, well, he resigned, but he, before he was thrown out, as it were, happens, and he was removed from the Privy Council, I note, because it was argued that if you can't be considered to be honourable by the House of Commons, then you certainly can't be considered to be right honourable, or get special seats at funerals and coronations and things like that. And likewise, I think this whole palaver started really with the Owen Paterson process. Owen Paterson, we on the Standards Committee found him guilty of an egregious case of paid lobbying. He'd been peddling influence on behalf of 2 companies that he was paid for, trying to get them contracts with the government and trying to get the government to use their system of marking and so on. And of course, what happened was the government tried to overturn it, tear the rule book up. Boris Johnson key in that. And that, interestingly, that rule about paid lobbying goes back to 1695, when the chair of one of the committees and the Speaker of the House were thrown out for taking a bribe from the City of London for trying to get the Orphans Bill through the House of Commons at record speed. This was not a bill to give money to orphans. This was a bill to take money off orphans and to give it to other projects. It was something of a misnomer. So you could say that there is nothing new under the sun, and I think that was slightly the kind of point that you were making. But I'm not so sure. I suspect we have a rum lot in this Parliament. A government chief whip, there have been quite a few, so I'm not in the last few years, so I'm not effectively naming them, said to me that there were some Conservative MPs who were such thugs and brutes that they should never have been selected as a Conservative Party candidate in a seat that they weren't going to win, let alone in one that they were going to win, and should never have become members of Parliament. But I think the big thing that is different in this Parliament is what I call the MOG tendency. That is the, oh, really, does this matter? Standards, really, the people in the dog and duck, they're not talking about this kind of stuff. And I think that is profoundly dangerous because it means it's effectively a free pass for bad behaviour. And it's certainly true that some things have changed. I'm slightly homosexual, and if... well, all right. It's just breaking it to you gently. 60 years ago, that would have landed me in prison. And today, I celebrated my civil partnership in the Palace of Westminster. So things have changed. And just because you're a divorcee doesn't mean you can't become king. So all of those aspects have changed. And it is certainly true that we used to brush an awful lot of things under the Pugin carpet. in relation to sexual misdemeanors in Parliament, sexually inappropriate behaviour and so on, and we don't do that anymore, which is one of the reasons that some of the cases have now come out into the public domain, and we've ended up suspending quite a few people in this Parliament. So some of that is good, but I think my biggest concern, well, I have two big concerns at the moment. I said this in the Chamber of the Commons the other day, part of this. The first is that we have a crazy paving of standards bodies now. MPs are regulated by IPSA, by the Commons Standards Committee, by the Privileges Committee, obviously by the criminal law as well, by the Speaker and his deputies in relation to the rules applying to the Chamber and conduct in the House, in some cases by ACOBA because they've been ministers, by the Ministerial Code if they are ministers, and by the Registrar of the House of Commons. We reckon in the Standards Committee that there's about 14 different bodies, and they don't all match. So when we were writing the new stationery rules for the House of Commons the other day on the Standards Committee, we came up against the issue that the paper is provided by the House. So it's the House that gets to decide whether you can use that paper and the letter and the envelopes to send something to somebody in your constituency. But the overprinting is paid for by IPSA, which has your name and your office address on it. So whose rule is it? Is it IPSA's rule, which is a statutory body and has a compliance officer laid down by statute? Or is it the House's authority, in which case it's the Standards Committee that gets to decide? And if somebody thinks that somebody's misbehaved, who do you report it to? It's a tiny thing, but it's material, because one of the things that often happens in the run-up to elections is that if you have a relatively safe seat like mine, the Rhondda's been Labour since 1885, the only seat in Parliament of which that is true, then you get MPs in more marginal seats come round to your office saying, can we have some of your spare envelopes that you don't need anymore because you're allowed £11,000 worth of them every year? I've always said no, because that is fundamentally corrupt. But I'm not sure that is the policy that is adopted by every one of the 650 MPs. So actually, that is quite a significant benefit you get, but even in that little area, there's lack of consistency. So one of the things that the Standards Committee is very keen to do, and this is one of the things that I do support about what Gordon Brown has said in his report, is that we do need to have greater consistency and coherence between all these different bodies. I am slightly nervous about saying this in the Chamber of the House of Commons, because one of the first speeches I made when I was an MP back in 2001 was about the creation of Ofcom. I'd been persuaded to speak by a whip because we didn't have anybody to speak on it. So I went in and I said it was great that Ofcom was being created because it was going to bring together 4 different bodies that regulated broadcasting and other industries, and it would be much more coherent and consistent, and to use a Valley's word, it would be tidy. Hansard renders this as to use a valet's word. It would be tidy. Now, we don't have very many valets in the valleys, and I've let it stand because I think it's just quite funny. You can correct Hansard if you want to, but then the story wouldn't work when I tell it. So anyway. And then my final point is this, which is MPs should be entitled to the same rights as anybody else. The Court of Public Opinion is in permanent session, and there are no rules of evidence. Hearsay is perfectly allowable, as is gossip or hearsay at a fifth remove. And I worry about this because if there is an instance, you read about it in a newspaper quite often, X has apparently an MP has complained about another MP and it's terribly serious. And you can't. I always think, oh well, I wonder whether that is going to be coming to my committee or not. So whether I can comment on it or not, or whether I'll have to recuse myself and so on. But sometimes what happens is that goes nowhere further. There was a story at one point. Sunday Times published a story which said that 54 MPs were being investigated for sexual misdemeanours by the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme. Completely and utterly untrue. Completely and utterly untrue, as I told the journalist 7 times before she printed it and after she printed it. It still stands in the news, and loads of other newspapers have used it and broadcasters, but you know, they just don't want to hear that version of the truth. But what I worry about is it's perfectly possible now, if you really want to damage an MP's reputation in their career, end their career, is you can try the police not interested, you can try the ICGS not interested, you can try the commissioner not interested, so you go to the party, and the party will suspend the whip like that. We've now, I think there's 20, I can't keep track of the numbers because people resign and things like that, but it's something in the region of twice the number of Lib Dem MPs are now in no party at all because they've had the whip suspended by their political party. None of those cases get dealt with at all swiftly, and I would guess that in most political parties they just hope that it will carry on unnoticed till the next general election. The candidate they won't be able to stand as a candidate for that political party, and the story will go away. That is not justice for the MP. It's certainly not justice for the complainant either. And I think that that's one of the areas that we really do have to change. Because I want Parliament to be a safe environment for everybody who works there, but I also want justice for MPs. I know that's not a very popular thing to end on, so I probably won't get a round of applause.
Thank you very much. I think the next frontier is to get a round of applause in the middle of your remarks. So that's the challenge for our third speaker, who is Dr. Hannah White. And Hannah is the director... We could just have a rolling background of applause. Hannah is the director of the Institute for Government, which works to promote more effective government, but also, I think, better public understanding of government. And Hannah has been a real force for good in the media in terms of promoting the understanding of the often quite incomprehensible things that have been happening in the last few years. She began her career as a clerk of the House of Commons, I think, and then was secretary to the Committee on Standards in Public Life. So she brings a number of different perspectives to this subject, and also recently published a book called Held in Contempt, which is about what's wrong with the House of Commons and how we might fix it. So I know this is a very busy day for you as well, so thank you for joining us, and we look forward to those waves of applause.
Thank you very much, Robert. So, as has been said, there's obviously no shortage of material to talk about on this topic. And I thought it might be most productive to try to sort of zoom out from the specifics, which we're all painfully aware of, particularly today, and try to think in a sort of concrete way about what a future government might be able to do about all this, and we've heard some interesting ideas already. I think the overarching most important point is definitely about leadership on this topic. I think, particularly in recent years, we've seen a lack of leadership on ethical standards, it's putting it mildly in relation to Boris Johnson, but also from other people in public life and within the civil service. And so I think it's often said that the tone from the top is one of the most important things in ethical systems, and I think that we've demonstrated what a lack of the right tone being set, what a corrosive effect that can have. So I think a new government or re-elected government seeking to address these issues needs to think about three things. I think they need to think, firstly, about clarity. They need to really reflect on what they expect of people in public life, and how they are going to communicate those expectations. And partly this is about modelling and tone from the top, as I say, but as Chris said, things do change. Societal expectations and so on change, and it's not right that our rules should stay the same. But what doesn't work is if you have a scandal, somebody is found guilty of having done something by whatever system is in place, and that is the moment at which you suddenly discover that the system is wrong or the standard is in the wrong place. What parties need to do is do that reflection up front and say to themselves, what are the standards we want, for example, ministers or MPs to follow, and those should be clearly communicated, as I say, with clarity. It's no good with, as we saw with Owen Paterson, only after he'd been investigated by the Standards Committee, the government suddenly deciding that actually that process was unfair, that there wasn't a sufficient appeals mechanism and so on, because they didn't like the outcome of the process. And that's where I think, for example, Chris's committee is required to do a review of the standard system in the House every Parliament. And so that's almost, doing that review in peacetime, as it were, rather than in the context of a very hot scandal, is a really important discipline. So that's clarity. Clarity is the first thing. The second thing is about consistency. So making sure that once you have the rules and you've communicated the rules, you then apply them consistently, regardless of who it is they're being applied to. I think we have seen a good example of that today with the Privileges Committee. It is no defence for Boris Johnson having broken the rules of the House that he was the Prime Minister. Different rules should not apply. In fact, I think the committee itself has said that it's a worse offence if you're Prime Minister to mislead the House. But people need to know that the rules will apply to them, that they don't have some special status because they're friends with someone, that they're just they represent a more important constituency in relation to the governing party or anything like that. They must know that the consequences will follow if they breach the rules. And that, I think, is really important in terms of consistency. And the third thing I think parties and a government needs to think about is support. These things are tricky. There are ethical dilemmas which people face in public office that they haven't necessarily faced in their normal lives. You are suddenly required to operate in different circumstances to those in which you've been before. This might be becoming an MP for the first time. This might be moving from being an MP to being a minister, where there are different rules on what you have to declare and things like that. And it's not reasonable to expect people to just know this stuff. At the same time, people themselves have an obligation to educate themselves. So I think too often we're in a situation where people are too grand, too busy, too important, or too inherently ethical to need any sort of guidance they feel on these sorts of topics. So it needs to come from both sides, but there needs to be a really clear expectation that there will be training and support on offer for people when they come into new roles, but also as they go along. And I think it's important that, again, using the example from Parliament, but that the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards has always made clear that they're there to create a sort of safe space if people want to come and say, I'm in this situation, I'm thinking this is the right decision, how should I handle it? That advice is there and on offer, and that people should be able to access it. So those are my three things I think governments need to think about: clarity, consistency, and support to people in public life. Just to go into a little bit more detail, on the clarity front, I'm going to have to disagree with Lord Butler on the statute question. I think I would really like us to be able to say we're going to set things back to a situation where the good chap's theory of government, chapesses, applies. Maybe that's the moment for applause. No. But I think what we've seen in recent years is that is not necessarily realistic. Now, I'm not somebody who would call for a full written constitution, but I do wonder whether there are actually elements of the system where what we've seen is people saying, well, where is it written down that I can't do X? And if it's not written down, then why should I have to follow that? It's just a convention. And I think that just a convention defense means that there maybe are some elements of the system that need to be there in statute. Things like the requirement for there to be a Prime Minister's advisor or ministerial interests. We had a long period under Boris Johnson where there wasn't anyone in that role. We at the IFG have argued both that the independent advisor should have the right to launch their own investigations, but also that role could be put on a statutory footing. We've said the ministerial code needs to be revised, partly for the clarity sort of principle that I advise, because working practices change all the time, and as we've seen with all the dispute over WhatsApp, for example, new technologies come into play, and people need to understand the ethical basis and ethical questions and think through the answers about how those things ought to be used. So the ministerial code, we've said the fact of there needing to be one should be put on a statutory basis, and it should require for it to be based on the Nolan Principles. Then we also have, I won't go into it all now, and perhaps we'll come to it in discussion, but thoughts about Aqaba. We also feel that the civil service itself needs a stronger statutory basis because there's a lack of clarity about the accountabilities at the top, and I think we've seen some of the tensions that has created playing out between ministers and civil servants in recent years, and we think that actually extending what's already in CRAG and setting out like, what is the role of the civil service, what is the scope of its responsibilities, and for what ought it to be held to account as opposed to ministers, it would be really valuable. And then there's a whole set of things around transparency, and I think when you think about why, and I totally accept the concerns that Lord Butler expresses about putting things into statute, I think statute combined with greater transparency around some of these questions and what is known about, say, when an investigation is launched or what meetings have been had, if we're thinking about the lobbying scandals we've had recently, that transparency side of things could really be tightened up. So, yeah, just to summarise, those are my sort of three things I think need to be thought about. It's clarity, consistency, and support to people in public life.
Wonderful, thank you. All our speakers have kept to time, so we've got lots of time for questions. So while you're warming up your batteries, perhaps if I could just put a question to each of our panellists. So firstly, Lord Butler, I wanted to ask you about the Nolan Committee and the sort of architecture of commissioners and standards that emerged in the 1990s. Because it seems to me that very much, part of the thinking behind that was that you could take these issues out of politics, that you could hand them over to people who were, in a sense, independent and above politics. But we live in a world today where those things are absolutely the object of political controversy. They are the blob, they're the elite, they are the establishment. And I wonder, can this model still actually work in an age of populist, anti-elitist politics? And then, sorry, do you want to go straight onto that? Or?
Okay, is the microphone helping? I think Nolan did a very good job. I think the 7 principles are excellent, but I don't think you can take these things out of politics. My criterion would be simple. The Prime Minister must be responsible for his administration. You can't give it to an independent person who, as it were, overrules the Prime Minister. And Parliament must be responsible for its members and how Parliament is conducted. That's what Parliament is there for. And so I don't think anybody should be set over those two, and you can't have an independent person. Nolan made some good recommendations. I'm in favour of the advisory people that he put up. I agree with Chris entirely. We've got far too many of them, and it needs to be simplified, but simple principle. Parliament in charge of Parliament, Prime Minister in charge of the government.
Thank you. And then a related question for Chris Bryant. We've seen over the last week an extraordinary assault on the Privileges Committee. And there's a, I think, very resonant warning in the report today that it might be difficult to conduct an inquiry of this kind in the future if there isn't some kind of challenge to the assault that's been made on the integrity of the committee and its members. And I wonder what you think can be done or needs to be done to rebuild cross-party support for institutions like the Privileges Committee, or to challenge the kind of attack that we've seen in the last few days.
Well, I've got to be careful because I think what the Privileges Committee are going to do is produce another report next week, which will say something like, what does the House think about all this intimidation, and ask the House to refer it to a newly constituted set of privileges, which might be chaired by somebody sitting here.
Right.
So I wouldn't want to have held a view before, because I've noticed that gets you into trouble. And there's a moot point. I mean, genuinely, there's a moot point, isn't there? Where does freedom of speech end and where does contempt of Parliament begin? Discuss. But I want to go back to this bit, which I completely disagree with. one of Churchill's famous quotes about Parliament is, he says, about democracy, he says it's terrible, but it's better than all the others that have been tried. But if you carry on to the next bit of his speech, it's an attack on the Labour government at the time. And he says, just because you become Prime Minister doesn't mean you can do whatever you want, broadly speaking. And I worry that this is the Jacob Rees-Mogg line.
Oh, my God.
Yes, well, quite. That's why I'm a bit shocked. It's a quite high understanding of the Crown or the executive. And actually, we decided in whenever it was, 1712 or 1713, that ministers had to be in Parliament, or broadly speaking. It's not, there's no statute that says that, but I mean, that's the decision we made. And because a vote was lost by 23 votes. So I think, actually, you need to drag government back into Parliament a bit more, rather than just say, oh no, the Prime Minister runs government and he can get on with it. Not least because if you've got 177 MPs who've been a minister in the last 2 years, they need to know what rules apply to them from day to day.
Thank you. I think, Hannah, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, maybe I can answer some things that Chris doesn't want to go into. I mean, I think it's... I agree with Lord Butler that in relation to this particular case, it's really important that Parliament has decided for Parliament where the line is, and has decided that the line has clearly been crossed. And I think it's really struck me talking to people in Parliament, former colleagues, former clerks, who've said, there are people in parliaments around the world watching this process and saying it is remarkable that there is a system in the UK Parliament that can do this, can bring back a former Prime Minister, can question them for several hours, and can produce a report which, in combination with the Recall of MPs Act, can have real consequences. And that is something really valuable. As you say, Robert, there have been these really remarkable attacks on these poor members of the committee, who it's the last committee they wanted to be on. Sorry, nothing to do with nothing to do with the chair. But sitting, if you're, you sit on privileges, you also sit on standards, and sitting in judgment on your peers is not a thing which, either gets you credit with your constituents or makes you popular necessarily with your peers. So these are. Maybe it does. Maybe I'm wrong. But
I've got a suggestion. Sorry.
These are senior members of the House who are doing a difficult job, but a really necessary job. And so I think it's really important that the House does go into this question of how these attacks which have been made on the committee in the wake of the inquiry, because it's almost done in a careless way now. You don't like an outcome, you just call something a kangaroo court. I mean, I feel sorry for the kangaroos, to be honest. They're much maligned, but it's the standard response. It was the Owen Paterson response. It was the John Bercow response when he didn't like the outcome of the bullying inquiry, and now it's the Boris Johnson response. And I think it's important that the House puts a line in the sand and says there should be consequences for this, and it's not okay to just do the political thing, because it's important that the House can draw this line.
I think you had a suggestion.
Well, it's just that we used to have the Privileges Committee, then we had the Standards and Privileges Committee, and then we had the Standards Committee and the Privileges Committee. And I would go back to having the Standards and Privileges Committee with lay members on it. Lay members could perfectly easily have come to the same set of conclusions as the MPs did this week. You don't have to be an MP to understand contempt of Parliament and lying.
Thank you. And then just one final question to put specifically to Hannah, which is the theme of this conference really is to think about, were there to be an incoming government in the next year, what should it do? And you've set out some suggestions, I think, for what you think could be done about standards. But as we've also heard today, this is a government that's going to be thinking about public service reform, about economic reform, the green transition. So who do you think should lead this process? Is it something for government? Is it something for Parliament? Do we need to be looking at things like citizens' juries and assemblies? How do we actually make reform happen?
So I think it would be a real mistake for an incoming government to think we've got bigger priorities, because we've seen over the last 3 years just how whatever agenda, an important agenda you've got and you've been elected with a large majority to deliver, that can be completely derailed by problems on this front. These are hygiene issues. These are things that you have to get right from the get-go, and the effort that is put into doing that from day one, I would argue, pays dividends, because you don't spend your time dealing with scandals, answering to Chris Bryant on the media. And so I think it's really worth the government showing leadership on this. That said, I also think that what the public thinks about these things is really important, and puts, if you like, can put strength in the arm of government. MPs are quite fond in the sort of course of debate of standing up and saying, what must our constituents think of whatever they don't like that's going on? But it can sometimes be a very throwaway line, and yet actually we know that the public is deeply unimpressed. There's some really good research that's been done by UCL on people's attitudes to democracy after Brexit, and they're thinking about what's important in terms of standards in public life, and they've done both surveys, and they've done a big citizens' assembly. And it shows that people really do care about this stuff, and what they think, I think, ought to inform what the parties think. So government can't give up responsibility for it, but taking account of what the public think and using that to really make the argument to sort of MPs or anyone else who don't think it's a priority, I think is maybe a way forward.
Thank you. Let's now have a round of questions. So we'll start here, please, with Morgan.
Hi, this is mostly a question for... Oh, sorry. This is mostly a question for Chris. I'm just very interested in your... Sorry. I'm from Labourlist, by the way. About your comments on suspended MPs and the... you're saying, you can go to the police, then you can go to the ICGS, but you can suspend the whip like that. Do you think that we should have a lower or a higher evidence bar? Do you think that the standards put in place by parties should be at the level of criminal? Or, I'm very interested in that comment. I would also be more interested in hearing the whole panel's views on the suspension of MPs from Parliament while they're under investigation, as was being discussed in the House this week. Yeah.
Thank you. So if we'll just take two others as well. So Tim.
I am just reading some Savanta polling, a snap poll on public attitudes to what's gone on today. And according to them, something like 18% of people don't believe that Boris Johnson deliberately misled the House of Commons. And that rises to 32%. They don't believe that Boris Johnson deliberately misled the House of Commons. 18%, right?
1-8.
Yeah, 1-8. Yeah. Don't worry, Chris. Yeah, that's right. just to reassure you, overall, 66% do believe he deliberately misled the House of Commons. But what I was going to ask was that 18% who believe that he didn't deliberately mislead the House of Commons rises to 32% of people who voted Conservative in 2019. Does that polarisation, those partisan filters, if you like, worry the panel?
Thank you. And then one more question from the gentleman at the back. Yes.
Thanks. Philip Murphy, History and Policy. I think it was Chris who mentioned John Profumo, and it just reminds you how things have changed so much in 60 years, because, of course, the press were very nervous about going after John Profumo, and it was only after people like George Wigg and Barbara Castle had named him in the House of Commons that they plucked up the courage. Completely different now, completely different. I mean, it was the press that brought down Boris Johnson, not the Standards Committee over Partygate. It's the press that now sort of sets the agenda. It's the press that set off a bomb under Parliament with the expenses scandal. What is the hope that Parliament itself will be able to regain the initiative, all of those different regulatory bodies, rather than simply dancing to the tune of the media, given how strong it is?
Thank you. 3 very interesting questions there. Perhaps we go in reverse order. Don't feel you have to answer all 3, but anything that you would particularly like to say. So, Hannah.
Thank you. Answer Morgan's question. In terms of the expulsion from the estate of MPs who are accused of serious violent or sexual offences, I think this is a really interesting move by the House of Commons Commission, and of course we don't yet know what the House overall thinks of it, because it's one of the first times when the rights of people on the estate who are not members have been attempted to be put at least on a par with the rights of members. So one of my problems with the way the Parliament runs itself as an institution is that there's, for good democratic reasons, in lots of cases, the rights of members are always privileged. And I think that there are lots of instances in which that's absolutely right, because Parliament exists in order for democracy to happen, and these are the people who've been elected or appointed in certain circumstances to do that job, and pretty much everyone else is there is to facilitate that. But it is also the workplace of those people, and when there is serious risk of harm to other people on the estate, I think it's right that through a fair and sufficiently rapid process, those risks are evaluated, and there is the potential for the House authorities to say that somebody shouldn't be on the estate. I think the rules as currently drafted have a lot of grey in them, and I think there's a problem, and Chris raised this, for people where, if something is said and then they are removed from the estate and then the process drags on and maybe there's an election and they can't stand and actually it was all to do with nothing. So I think there's more work to be done, but I'm really interested that the principle there has just shifted that balance towards saying actually there are lots of people in Parliament and the people who aren't members have some rights too, not to be exposed to undue risk. Tim, yes, I do find that quite alarming. I think, I've been reading views of people much more expert on these sorts of questions than myself, who've drawn a distinction between the extent of the polarization in America and the sort of Trump, how many people still are totally unbothered despite what's come out about Trump, and would still be totally happy to vote for himself in the States, and people saying, well, we're not there here, but I worry that the actual answer, we're not there yet. Now, I am, maybe we should have cause for optimism, and both about what's happened today and, going forward, if, we have new people entering politics at a new election, whether that's new government, new set of MPs, maybe we're not just going in one direction, but I agree those are worrying figures.
Yes, I agree with Hannah about the issue about, well, I don't like to call it precautionary exclusion, because I think that focuses on exclusion as the only thing you should do if there's if a member of Parliament has been arrested or charged or is under police bail for a violent or sexual crime. I think there may be all sorts of other mitigations you could put in place, such as you're not allowed to go to the bars, or you're not allowed to go on foreign travel, or you're not going to be in an office in an office with locked doors. You're going to be in an office in an open plan environment or whatever. So there are lots of things you could do. There's a thing rattling around in my head about maybe it would be better if the political parties didn't do their own discipline, and it was taken out of the hands of the whips and the party managers, and it was simply all given to the independent complaints and grievance scheme, because then you can't shop around for different bodies. It would mean that it would be kept confidential, which is better for both sides of the argument, for the complainant and the respondent, and it means that nobody's just trying to protect the party, and also it's professionally run. So that's where I'm at. I don't know whether my party is or anybody else's party. The partisanship, when I got into trouble way back in 2003 relating to when I invented the selfie, and the journalist, no, not a journalist, an MP told me at the time, just lie, Chris, because at least 40% will believe you. And I think that is the principle that some people have adopted of late. We call it Trumpian, I guess, but it's very strong at the moment, I think. And I think there is a real issue about ministers lying to the House. I'd add Suella Braverman and Rishi Sunak to this list. It's fairly consistent, I think, now, and people just get away with it. And they've got a system of correcting the record, which has been in place since 2007, I think. So I worry about that. But I also think that this will be an issue in the general election. It will be. And Labour should make it one, to be honest. And that means that Labour's got to come up with a set of proposals on how we are going to improve things. And I know that Keir is very focused on that. And the good news is that I have a book coming out in August called Code of Conduct, which might have some suggestions on things that we should do. Because I think there are quite a few. You know, we may want to do more about second jobs, for instance. And I worry, at the moment we've been telling people off for lobbying ministers on behalf of their paying clients, well, but we've not told off any of the ministers for accepting the lobbying. So I think we could do something there. John Profumo, you know, it's not the press that brought Boris Johnson down, it's Boris Johnson that brought Boris Johnson down. I mean, honestly, he just didn't believe the rules ever applied to him, and he always thought that his charm was so phenomenal that he could charm the room into submission, and he didn't bother to... I mean, who would have thought that he'd forget to do the paperwork for resigning until the following Monday? I am... I don't like this good chaps rule thing. I mean, because of the word chaps, but more importantly, because sometimes the chaps aren't good. There are bad people in Parliament. Bad people in lots of different ways. And if you're relying on convention, it just doesn't work anymore because they will abuse it. And precedent is nothing. Precedent only means what we did last time and the time before. It doesn't bind you. And, for instance, why on earth did Rishi Sunak allow a resignation honours list to go through when he knew that the person it was relating to might be found guilty of lying to Parliament and be thrown out of Parliament within a few days? Why? He says precedent. Baloney. Absolute baloney. Just didn't want to have a row within the Conservative Party. Sorry, I'm getting partisan now.
I think we're going to fall foul of all sorts of product placement laws now in terms of...
Yes,
but anyway.
no, please don't buy it.
Robin.
Well, I'm pleased to hear Chris say that he thinks this is fertile area for the election. I think it is, and I think that it would be very good if the Labour Party has proposals. But what I would say is don't bring statute into it. You can't legislate against bad people. There will always be bad people, and those bad people, if the system works, will be caught out by their peers or ultimately by the electorate. And the more you try to bring statute in, and this is really, I think, important for the priorities of the Labour government if it gets in, they won't want to waste time legislating on this sort of stuff. They've got much more important things to do. So change the machinery by all means in the way that Chris has suggested, rationalise it, but for goodness sake, don't bring the law and the judges into it.
Thank you.
The voters trust judges more than politicians, which is interesting when politicians keep on attacking judges. And it's very interesting when politicians who formerly wanted to limit judicial review then go to judicial review the first time they need it.
But is there a danger that judges become less popular if they're seen as constraining politicians that people align themselves with?
Not so far.
Okay. Let's have another round of questions. So I think Tom has a question.
Thank you. This isn't necessarily on standards, but I can't resist as Robin is here. Hannah talked about putting the civil service on a more statutory footing. If I waved a magic wand and you could be reappointed Cabinet Secretary tomorrow, what would be the one reform that you would implement?
Well, of course, there are bits of statute that apply to the civil service. There's the 2010 Governance Act, which the Labour Party brought in, which was fine. It said there should be a Civil Service Code, and I got no problem about that. There's the Exchequer and Audit Act, which produces the one example where a civil servant is responsible to Parliament rather than to a minister. So that's fine. There's no other area where I want to see statute introduced as far as the civil service is concerned. What's necessary, I think, is to rebuild the trust which I believe was there during my career and made it a happy career between politicians and the civil servants. And that has been damaged, not, I think, by the blob, but by politicians being willing to blame civil servants when their proposals don't get easily implemented. I think all this talk about a conspiracy of the civil service against ministers is absolute nonsense. And I think we've had politicians promising too much and then blaming the civil service when they can't be delivered.
Thank you. Gentleman right at the back. If you could just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Excuse my speech, I don't speak very well in public, so I'd better do the best I can. So, Chris, Brian, you said that if a parliamentarian was caught lying in Parliament, they would be suspended or withdrawn from Parliament. Suppose a constituent felt that MP spoke out of character, so the words must have come from somebody else. Could those words come from a clerk who drafted the statement that said in Parliament? If so, where's the accountability? Thanks very much.
Thank you. Did you catch that?
I've just been diagnosed with hearing loss, so I'm afraid I didn't hear that or couldn't make it out. So I wonder whether did anybody else?
No, I couldn't, I'm afraid. Is there somebody close?
I'll do the best I can. Can you hear that? You said earlier that if an MP made a statement in Parliament, it was lies, it would be suspended or withdrawn from Parliament. However, if a constituent felt the statement made by the MP was out of character, that statement could have been drafted by a clerk. So where would the accountability be? In the meantime, because I found this, I had to research this, and what I found was appalling. So I no longer support the parliamentary sovereignty.
Thank you. Yeah, so roles of clerks and officials and advisors, perhaps, I think. If we could take another question
My
as well.
favourite thing I have to do as chair of the Committee on Standards is when, well, it's not my favourite, it's my least favourite. It's when the committee decides that a member has to apologise to the House, and it then always says in our report, and the terms of the apology, the words of the apology should be agreed between the Speaker and the chair of the Committee on Standards. Oh my Lord, how MPs hate doing a proper sorry. I mean, nearly always starts with, unfortunately, the committee has come to a completely ludicrous decision and I have been forced to apologise, which I am obviously not very happy. Anyway, It goes through 18 different iterations, and then at the end I always have to go, listen, if you're not going to do it properly, I just have to take you back to the committee and we'll increase the sanction. And then suddenly they go, oh, all right, fine.
We're almost out of time, so I'm just going to invite each of our speakers, if there's any final comment they would like to make, anything they would like to respond to, and then we'll thank our speakers and move to the final session of the day. So, would any of you, is there anything you're burning to say?
I've got one, which is, we often, there's a lot more scrutiny on MPs, and I understand that because we're elected, but actually Parliament has two houses. And the code of conduct for the House of Lords is very different from that for the House of Commons. The process is very different from that for the House of Lords from the House of Commons. And I think that needs review. I would like to see something more similar. I understand they're there for different reasons and so on, and they're not elected in different ways. Well, very few are elected, aren't they, under the bizarre hereditary peers election process, which is very Blackadder. But I would like to, we are working with the Conduct Committee and the Lords to see whether there are ways that we can align our rules a little bit more. But I would also like to see greater alignment of publishing of interests of ministers with MPs. That, I think, is now just a glaring silliness. And oddly, was the exemption under which Priti Patel registered going to a Bond premiere as a minister rather than as an MP, because, according to Michael Ellis, James Bond exercises executive functions. We pointed out that, yes, but he's MI6 and not Home Office, and also, by the way, a fictional character. But anyway, I just think that's bonkers. And that exemption was introduced. We can find no paperwork for why it was introduced in the new Code of Conduct in the Commons that was introduced in 2015. And I was really fed up with the government when they voted down our suggestion that we should go back to the old system, that everybody registers everything in one place.
Thank you. Any other final comments that Robin or Hannah would like to make?
Well, the bee in my bonnet is how much of law is now being made by statutory instrument over which Parliament exercises no effective control. There's no reason why Parliament can't vote down statutory instruments, but it doesn't do it because there's a conspiracy between the two leading parties. The opposition at the moment doesn't want to do it because it's going to be the government at some point, and therefore it suits it that things can be done by statutory instrument. But this is Parliament failing to do its job.
Well, hang on. So I completely agree about secondary statutory instruments and all the rest of it. We do tend to try to vote them down in the House of Commons, but we always lose because we've not got a majority. But the even worse element of it is that sometimes we only get an opportunity to vote against a motion on a standing on a statutory instrument if the government allows us time. And despite the fact that historically that's been the precedent, government has binned that repeatedly over the last 13 years. Harumph.
Further harumph. I totally agree with all of that, but also the massive decline in standards of scrutiny of legislation in the House of Commons. I was speechless when I heard that the government was planning to give the House 2 days in Committee of the Whole House to consider the illegal migration bill. A bill which, in my grand old age, but when I was a clerk in the House of Commons 20 years ago, would have gone into committee for several weeks, and there would have been detail. Now, I'm not claiming that line-by-line scrutiny in committee is a panacea or brilliant, but, you would have had lots of probing amendments and questions, and these things, the argument is Committee of the Whole House is for things which are high-profile and political important, and everyone gets a say, and that's a better way of doing it than in committee where it's a smaller set of MPs. But it's completely disingenuous. Committee of the Whole House is a really ineffective method of scrutinising anything, and so the Lords is doing the heavy lifting on primary legislation, and that is, again, in primary legislation is where lots of these powers are being given away by Parliament to government to do things by secondary at a later date. So I think that is, we really, if Labour wants to do one really good thing for the robustness of their policy making, so that when it hits reality, it doesn't come up against, the first things that should have been thought of, but that were never raised. It is to think properly about what parliamentary scrutiny needs to look like and allow time for that. And sorry, just one other point which I was going to make before I got onto that hobby horse, which we all seem to be on. Was just a sort of slight note of alarm linking back to what Tim was saying about sort of partisanship. I agree with Robin that the outcome today was a good day for Parliament. I am alarmed by the news that lots of Conservative MPs are planning to abstain on Monday, because I really fear that is what will then be used to say that this is this has been a partisan process. In the end, only the Labour Party and the other parties voted in the House to endorse the outcome of the committee's report, and that will really undermine things. And I understand, as the pressures on Conservative MPs that Chris describes, but I don't think that's any excuse for not saying that actually this is an important line in the sand that ought to be drawn on behalf of Parliament. But then I'm not a politician, so of course I can say that.
It's just worth commenting that the House of Lords sat till 4:20 in the morning last week on the immigration bill, so at least one House of Parliament's doing its job.
Whereas I think the House of Commons stopped sitting at 2 p.m. on Tuesday because there was no business. 2:20, yes. Anyway, I think this is an issue that's going to run and run. We're going to have a very short break now before our final session, which begins at 5 o'clock, I think. So if you need a comfort stop, then do make the most of that. But thank you very much to all three of our speakers for a really interesting discussion.